Some stories begin with a dream. Others begin with a verdict. Imagine being only 19 years old, standing on the edge of everything you've ever dreamed of, only to hear one sentence that changes your life forever. A doctor looks you in the eye and quietly says, "You may never play professional tennis again." For most people, that would be the end of the story. But sometimes the end is only where the real story begins. Hello, my friend. I'm so glad you're here with me today. Find a comfortable place, take a slow breath, and let the noise of the outside world fade away for just a little while. Let me ask you something. Have you ever been told that your greatest dream was simply impossible? Have you ever felt that your own body, your own circumstances, or your own fears had become the biggest obstacle standing between you and the life you wanted most? Most of us face moments that seem impossible to overcome, moments when giving up feels like the only reasonable choice. Tonight, I'd like to tell you the story of a young man whose greatest opponent was never Roger Federer. It was never Novak Djokovic. It wasn't even time itself. His greatest opponent was his own body. Now, close your eyes for just a moment. Picture a quiet medical office in Spain. The room is almost silent. A young athlete sits across from a specialist. His foot has been hurting for months. He expects a treatment plan, a few weeks of rest, maybe a minor surgery. Instead, he hears words that no athlete ever wants to hear. The doctor has found a rare degenerative condition, Müller-Weiss syndrome, a disease that slowly destroys the bones inside the foot. The verdict is devastating. Professional tennis may no longer be possible. He is only 19 years old. Most careers haven't even begun at that age. His might already be over. No one would have blamed him for walking away. No one would have questioned his decision. Because sometimes life doesn't defeat us with failure. Sometimes it defeats us with pain. Constant, relentless, unseen. But there are a very small number of people who hear the impossible and quietly answer, "Not yet." This is one of those stories. This is not simply the story of the king of clay, not yet. This is the story of the frightened young man who almost never became Rafael Nadal. So, come with me, my friend. Let's go back to where it all began. Every legend has a beginning. Long before the Grand Slam trophies, long before the roaring crowds and the unforgettable rivalries, there was simply a little boy growing up on a quiet island called Mallorca. Life there was slow, simple, peaceful. The sea was never far away. Neither were the red clay courts where everything would begin. Rafael Nadal was born on June 3, 1986. From the very beginning, he seemed to have more energy than anyone around him. He climbed trees, played football, raced bicycles, swam in the sea. Standing still was never part of who he was. Sport wasn't just something he enjoyed. It was his language, his way of understanding the world. His family noticed it immediately, especially one man, his uncle, Tony Nadal. Tony wasn't interested in raising a tennis superstar. He wanted to raise a good human being. Discipline came before talent. Respect came before victory. Excuses were never accepted. If Rafael complained, he ran more. If he became frustrated, he practiced longer. Every lesson was simple. Nothing would ever be given to him. Everything had to be earned. There was another unusual decision that would quietly change tennis history forever. Rafael was naturally right-handed, but Uncle Tony asked him to play tennis with his left hand. At first, it felt awkward, uncomfortable, even strange, but day after day, the movement became natural. Without realizing it, the young boy was building one of the most dangerous forehands the sport would ever see. While other children dreamed about winning matches, Tony taught a different lesson. Every practice wasn't about being better than someone else. It was about being better than yesterday. Some afternoons, the training felt endless. The Mallorca sun showed no mercy. Neither did Uncle Tony. One more ball, one more sprint, one more repetition, again and again and again. The little boy didn't understand it then, but years later he would. Champions are not created on the biggest stages. They are created on ordinary days when nobody is watching. Looking back, those quiet courts in Mallorca weren't simply where Rafael Nadal learned tennis. They were where he learned how to suffer, how to endure, and how to keep moving forward when everything inside you wanted to stop. That lesson would soon become his greatest weapon, because before long, the world was finally about to discover the boy from Mallorca. Chapter 3. The King Begins. By the time Rafael Nadal turned 18, something extraordinary was already happening. The young boy from Mallorca was no longer just another promising teenager. He was becoming the player nobody wanted to face. Every match felt different. Every rally felt heavier. His speed seemed impossible, his determination even more so. While others searched for easy points, Rafa fought for every single one. No ball was ever out of reach. No point was ever truly lost. His opponents began to notice. Something about this teenager was different. He wasn't simply trying to beat them, he was trying to outlast them, to exhaust them, to break their belief. Then came Paris, Roland Garros, the tournament that would change everything. Most teenagers dream of playing on court Philippe Chatrier. Rafael Nadal walked onto it as though he belonged there. No fear, no hesitation, only purpose. Match after match, the victories kept coming. His heavy topspin pushed opponents far behind the baseline. His relentless defense turned impossible shots into impossible winners. The red clay seemed to move with him. Every slide, every sprint, every forehand, everything looked natural. The crowd had never seen anything quite like it. Then, on June 5, 2005, history was made. At just 19 years old, Rafael Nadal lifted his very first Grand Slam trophy. Roland Garros. His dream had become reality. But perhaps the most remarkable part wasn't that he had won, it was how he won. Playing every point as though it were the last point of his life. Most champions celebrate after victory. Rafa celebrated by preparing for the next challenge. He wasn't satisfied. He wasn't finished. He believed there was always another level to reach, another mountain to climb. Nobody knew it then, not even Rafa himself, but that afternoon in Paris wasn't the beginning of a great career, it was the beginning of a kingdom. A kingdom built one match, one battle, one impossible point at a time. The world had just met its future king of clay.
The first title changed everything. But it wasn't the trophy that surprised the tennis world. It was what happened next. Most young champions celebrate their breakthrough. They relax, they enjoy the moment. Rafael Nadal did the opposite. The morning after every victory, he was back on the practice court, working, sweating, improving. To him, winning was never the destination. It was simply permission to work even harder. Year after year he returned to the red clay, and year after year his opponents began arriving already carrying a quiet fear. Because beating Rafa on clay was no longer just difficult, it felt impossible. His heavy topspin pushed players far behind the baseline. His speed turned defense into attack. His determination made every rally feel endless. Every point became a battle. Every game felt like survival. One by one, the greatest players of his generation fell. Roger Federer, Novak Djokovic, Andy Murray, Stan Wawrinka. Champions who conquered the rest of the tennis world walked onto clay knowing they would have to play the match of their lives, and even then it still might not be enough. Then history began to take shape. Win after win, the numbers became almost impossible to believe. 20 victories, 40, 60, then 81 consecutive wins on clay, a record the sport had never seen before. People searched for explanations. Was it his fitness, his forehand, his mentality? Perhaps it was all of them, or perhaps it was something far simpler. Rafa never believed he deserved to win. He believed he had to earn every single point, again and again and again. The trophies continued to arrive. Roland Garros became his kingdom. The red clay became his home. The world gave him a new name, the King of Clay. It wasn't a nickname. It was a title earned through suffering, through sacrifice, through thousands of invisible hours when nobody was watching. Looking back, those years were never about domination alone. They were a masterclass in discipline. A reminder that greatness isn't built through talent. It's built through consistency. And yet, the greatest challenge of Rafael Nadal's life was still waiting for him. Chapter 5. The match that changed everything. By the summer of 2008, Rafael Nadal had already conquered the clay. The King of Clay was no longer a question. He was a fact. But there was one mountain he had never truly climbed: Wimbledon. For 5 straight years, one man had ruled the grass: Roger Federer, elegant, effortless, almost untouchable. Many believed grass was simply not Nadal's surface, too fast, too slippery, too different, but Rafa never believed in limits, only in work. Every season he returned, a little stronger, a little faster, a little closer, until finally the 2 greatest players in the world stood across from each other once again. Centre Court, Wimbledon, July 6, 2008. The atmosphere felt different. Nobody could explain why. It simply felt like history was waiting. The match began. Every rally became a battle. Every game felt like a final. Hours passed. Rain stopped play. Darkness crept across the court. Still, neither man would surrender. Federer fought like a king, protecting his throne. Nadal fought like a warrior who refused to stop climbing. 5 sets, nearly 5 hours. Every point carried the weight of history. Then, late in the evening, on the fading light, it happened. Roger Federer sent one final ball long. Silence, for just a heartbeat. Then centre court erupted. Rafael Nadal fell onto the grass, not with celebration, with relief, with disbelief, with every emotion he had carried for years. At last he had done what so many believed could never be done. He had defeated Roger Federer at Wimbledon. Many people still call it the greatest tennis match ever played, not because of the score, not because of the trophies, but because it showed 2 champions pushing each other beyond every known limit. That night, Rafael Nadal didn't simply win Wimbledon. He proved that destiny belongs to those who refuse to accept their limits. And from that moment, his story was no longer about clay. Chapter 6. The pain that never left. From the outside, it looked like perfection. The trophies, the victories, the records, the standing ovations. People saw the champion. What they never saw was the pain. Because while the world celebrated, Rafael Nadal was fighting a battle that never truly ended. Every morning he woke up not knowing how his body would respond. Some days simply walking hurt. Some days putting on his tennis shoes was painful. The injuries never arrived one at a time. Knees, wrists, back, ribs, hip, and always the foot. The same foot that doctors had once warned might end his career before it truly began. For years, he learned to live with pain, not occasionally, every day. Before matches, his body needed treatment. After matches, it needed even more: ice baths, physiotherapy, recovery sessions, hours that fans never saw. Many athletes play through pain. Rafa built an entire career around it. There were moments when he wondered if it was finally over. Each comeback became harder. Each recovery took longer. Every return required even greater faith. But somehow, he always found a way to come back. Not because he ignored the pain, but because he refused to let pain decide who he could become. Perhaps that was his greatest victory. Not Roland Garros, not Wimbledon, not the Grand Slams. It was his decision to keep believing when his own body gave him every reason to stop. Millions of people saw the trophies, very few ever saw the price. And yet, the greatest comeback of Rafael Nadal's life was still waiting just ahead. Chapter 7. The Miracle of Melbourne. There comes a moment in every athlete's life when talent is no longer enough. The body slows down, recovery takes longer, every injury leaves a deeper scar, and every comeback becomes a little harder than the last. For Rafael Nadal, that moment seemed to arrive again and again. By the beginning of 2022, many believed his greatest victories were already behind him. He was 35 years old. His body had endured more pain than most athletes experience in an entire lifetime. Some experts questioned whether he could still compete at the highest level. Others wondered if retirement was finally the only path remaining. Rafa never argued. He never made promises. He simply went back to work, quietly, patiently, one practice, one recovery session, one small step at a time. Then came Melbourne, the Australian Open. Few people expected him to lift the trophy. Even fewer believed he could survive 2 exhausting weeks against the best players in the world. But match after match, he kept fighting. Not perfectly, not effortlessly, but relentlessly. Every victory felt earned. Every celebration felt humble. Until finally he stood, one match away from history. Across the net stood Daniil Medvedev, young, powerful, confident. The final began badly. 2 sets to love. For most players, the story would have ended there. But Rafael Nadal had spent his entire life refusing to believe that a match was over until the final point had been played. Point by point, the momentum began to change. A forehand, a passing shot, a break of serve, then another. The crowd could feel it. Something extraordinary was unfolding. Hours passed. The match became a battle of endurance, not only against an opponent, but against time, against pain, against doubt. And then, after more than 5 unforgettable hours, it happened. One final point, one final roar. Rafael Nadal collapsed onto the court. Not because he was exhausted, but because he finally allowed himself to believe it was real. Against every prediction, against every setback, against every injury, he had become Australian Open champion once again. His 21st Grand Slam title, a new record. But perhaps the record was never the greatest achievement. The real miracle was that a man who had spent his entire career being told what he could no longer do continued to prove what the human spirit is still capable of achieving. That night, the world didn't simply witness one of the greatest comebacks in tennis history. It witnessed one of the greatest lessons in resilience ever seen. Chapter 8. More than a champion. When people talk about Rafael Nadal, they often begin with the numbers. 22 Grand Slam titles, 14 Roland Garros crowns, Olympic gold, Davis Cup victories, records that may never be broken. But numbers have never been the reason people love him, because statistics can tell us how many matches someone won. They can never explain how they made us feel. Away from the spotlight, Rafa remained the same person he had always been. Quiet, respectful, grounded. Every victory was accepted with humility, every defeat with dignity. He never blamed the court, the weather, the crowd, or his opponent. He believed that respect was something you earned every single day. His greatest rival, Roger Federer, once said that competing against Rafa made him a better player. Novak Djokovic said their rivalry pushed both of them to levels they never imagined. That is perhaps the greatest compliment any athlete could receive, not simply being remembered for winning, but for helping everyone around you become better. Away from tennis, Rafa never forgot where he came from. Mallorca was always home, family always came first, fame never changed his priorities. Through the Rafa Nadal Foundation, thousands of children were given new opportunities. Education, sport, hope. Because Rafa understood something that every true champion eventually learns. Success means very little. If it is kept only for yourself, its greatest value is found when it is shared. Looking back, perhaps, Rafael Nadal's greatest legacy will never be the trophies. It will be the example he left behind, an example of discipline, humility, respect, and the courage to keep moving forward even when the road ahead seems impossible. Long after the final match has been played, those lessons will remain. Because champions eventually retire, character never does. Chapter 9. The Last Match. For almost 20 years, the tennis world had grown used to one familiar sight. Rafael Nadal walking onto the court, head down, racket in hand, ready to fight for every point. It felt as though it would last forever. But nothing lasts forever, not even the greatest careers. In 2024, Rafa made the announcement everyone had quietly feared. His journey was coming to an end. Not because his love for tennis had disappeared. It hadn't. If anything, he loved the game more than ever. But love alone cannot heal a body that has given everything. For years, his foot had carried more pain than most people could imagine. His body had answered every challenge, every comeback, every impossible battle, until finally it whispered one simple truth: enough. His final appearance would come at the Davis Cup, representing Spain, one last time. Not for records, not for rankings, simply for the country he had always been proud to represent. When he walked onto the court, the crowd rose to its feet. Not because they expected another miracle, but because they knew they were witnessing the final chapter of a legend. Every point felt different. Every applause lasted a little longer. No one wanted the moment to end. When the match was over, the result barely mattered. The scoreboard would eventually be forgotten. What people would remember was the man, the fighter, the competitor, the humble champion who had given every part of himself to the sport he loved. Standing there, one last time, Rafael Nadal looked around the arena. The cheers, the flags, the faces. Memories from an entire lifetime seemed to pass in a single moment. There were tears, there were smiles, and above all, there was gratitude. Gratitude for every match, every comeback, every impossible point that somehow became possible. When Rafa finally waved goodbye, he didn't leave as simply one of the greatest tennis players in history. He left as something even rarer, a champion who had earned the love of the entire world. His racket would fall silent, but his example never would, and perhaps that is the greatest victory of all. Chapter 10. The Legacy of Never Giving Up. Every career must eventually come to an end. Every stadium will one day grow quiet. Every trophy will gather a little dust. Even the greatest champions cannot escape time. But every once in a generation, someone leaves behind something that time can never touch. Rafael Nadal won 22 Grand Slam titles. He lifted 14 Roland Garros trophies. He inspired millions around the world, yet somehow none of those achievements feel like his greatest legacy. Because when people remember Rafa, they rarely begin with the numbers. They remember the effort, the determination, the sweat covering every point, the refusal to surrender. They remember a man who fought for every ball as though it might be his last. A champion who never believed he was bigger than the game, who respected every opponent, every fan, every opportunity to step onto a tennis court. Perhaps that is why children still copy his forehand, his celebrations, his rituals, not because they dream of becoming Rafael Nadal, but because they dream of becoming someone who never quits. That is a far greater gift. Years from now, new champions will arrive. New rivalries will capture the world's attention. Records will eventually be broken. That is the nature of sport. But character never grows old. Humility never becomes outdated. Respect never loses its value. And courage will always have the power to inspire. Somewhere on a small tennis court, a child is picking up a racket for the very first time. He doesn't know how many titles Rafael Nadal won. He doesn't know the statistics, the rankings, or the records. But one day he'll hear the story of a young boy from Mallorca who refused to give up even when his own body told him he should. And perhaps that story will become the reason he keeps going when life becomes difficult. Because greatness isn't reserved for extraordinary people. It is built through ordinary choices made over and over again. To keep trying, to keep believing, to keep standing, back up, one more time. That was Rafael Nadal's greatest lesson. Not how to win, but how to endure, how to remain humble in victory, how to remain hopeful in defeat, and how to leave every place a little better than you found it. So perhaps the next time life asks more of you than you believe you can give, remember the young boy from Mallorca. Remember the champion who kept fighting long after most people would have stopped. And remember that the strongest people are not always the most talented. They are often the ones who simply refuse to quit. Thank you for spending these moments with me. If Rafael Nadal's story has inspired you in any way, I hope you'll carry a small piece of his determination into your own life. Because every dream worth chasing will ask something of you. The question isn't whether the road will be difficult. It almost certainly will. The real question is whether you'll keep walking when the path becomes hard. Until next time, take care of yourself. And never forget that sometimes the greatest victories aren't the ones the world applauds. They're the quiet victories that happen inside us when we choose not to give up.